I was trying to explain to Dr. Glasser our Irish time, where 11 o'clock means kind of 10 quarter past 11. So we're anxious to start now. So it is with great pleasure that I do introduce to you Dr. William Glasser. And for us to have a name that's very familiar to us and ideas that we've had over the years come to life before us is a special pleasure. And Dr. Glasser has been extremely helpful and willing to come over here at, you know, very sort of distance arrangements, and to do it with very good grace and very good will. And we look forward to what he has to say today. And so I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Glasser.
Thank you. I have a reality therapist whom I've trained in the United States named Sean O'Dwyer, who is from this area undoubtedly, and he prevailed upon me to come to Ireland, and arranged actually to meet with Arthur Dunn, and so I appreciate the fact that I could come here and express my ideas and explain them in a setting which is different from what I'm used to. I'm not, you know, deeply familiar with the Irish culture or the Irish problems, but my experience has been, I worked in a lot of countries, that the problems people have are pretty much the same all over. They may have a little different shades, but we're all members of the same species, and we all tend to try to live our life in similar ways, which I'll explain today. I think maybe to begin with, I ought to give you a little bit of an understanding of how reality therapy came to be. I was trained like most people in the United States were trained. I was a psychologist before I went to medical school and became a psychiatrist, and my training was in traditional counseling or traditional, I prefer to use the word counseling rather than therapy, or because therapy to me is a less accurate word. What we all do, whether we're psychiatrists or psychologists or social workers or counselors, is basically, I think it's most accurate to say that we all counsel people. But I was trained in the traditional Freudian kind of a counseling method, which didn't particularly appeal to me. They didn't seem to apply to me personally, nor to the people I know. And the major flaw with the Freudian training which I had, which really, I think, helped me to begin the ideas of reality therapy, was that it seemed that most of the effort of the therapist was directed at teaching the person, teaching him and supporting him and agreeing with the fact that he was in pretty bad shape, and that he was the victim of a bad mother, a bad father, a bad toilet training, or bad something or other, which all of which didn't seem to make much sense to me for lots of reasons, and among them was the fact that the therapy seemed to say that one could be irrevocably or practically irrevocably damaged when you were very, very young, and that this psychological damage would then stay with you all of your life. And this didn't seem to be the case. I certainly did talk to many people in my younger days when I used to do as I was taught to explore their childhood in great length and find out that most people who were in trouble could tell you they had a miserable childhood. And however, I was smart enough to know from my own experience and friends and family and everyone else, a lot of people who weren't in trouble had a miserable childhood too. And so and if we would have a little show and tell session here in this room among people who are probably fairly competent right now at your age in life, all of you didn't have the most wonderful mother and father and all the loving things that you're supposed to have, but somehow or other you've managed to figure out a life which is reasonably, works reasonably well for you. And so I began to feel that people's troubles, whatever they were certainly now, and that we should deal with the now. And that if people were to solve their problems, they had to be solved now, and that it would be much better to plan for the future, as much as you can plan for the future, but not neglect the present, which is, of course, paramount in our lives. And if the past was bad, leave it be. There's nothing you can do. You can't unwrite history, at least even though George Orwell claims people try, it's very difficult to unwrite it. but people can live despite their history, and people can overcome their history, and the good therapy will help them to do that. So with all these difficulties, I began to split myself. I met a teacher, luckily a Dr. Harrington, who was a man who had had a lot of experience, and he became my teacher just through circumstance and through chance, and he was very supportive of my moving in the direction that I finally went to in reality therapy, which really holds that people are responsible for what they do, and that certainly it's the job of the therapist to help them to understand that they are. Not the job of the therapist to say you're not responsible, but quite the opposite. On the other hand, it's not the job of the therapist to be critical or punitive if they do something wrong, but rather to say you've made some mistakes, and your life has not worked out well, or you and I wouldn't be talking right now, and let's figure out how we can help it to work out better. And this idea of a personal responsibility, sticking in the present, planning a better life for the future is in a sense the basis of reality therapy. And the therapy has grown over the years, and it's become, I suppose, more complex. And what's happened to it in recent years, these ideas, is I've developed a theory. I haven't developed the theory. I have been offered a theory which I have embraced, and in embracing this theory, I think I've carried it further than anyone who has used this theory in the past has carried it in terms of human functioning, but I can't say that I didn't develop the theory. That would be a mistake. And the theory is called control theory. And we'll go into that in some detail today. Don't worry about the word control theory right now. But the point is that control theory and reality therapy are now so intertwined at this particular time that it's really hard to say where one ends. But reality therapy was a practical series of steps without, in any essence, a form of psychological theory to underpin it. And I couldn't ever find a psychological theory that made any real sense to me, so I just taught what was called an empirical thing called reality therapy, which I think some of you are to some extent familiar with. And I guess everyone looks around for a theory, and I was offered control theory. I just stumbled upon it. A friend of mine said, read a book, a very obscure book in the United States, written by a man who's devoted his life to control theory, but it's very obscure, and it's very much in a theoretical construction. It's not very practical. There's nothing in it that's really practically usable, yet it's a theory. It's a theory that's actually been used more by engineers than psychologists, and it turns out, and I think I'll explain it to you if I can, it really shouldn't be called a psychological theory because even the word psychology has a lot of flaws in the word itself. It makes it seem as if our psychological behavior is somewhat divorced from or different from our physiologic behavior, when actually the most accurate thing would be to think of us as biologic organisms. We are living organisms. And I believe, and I'll try to explain today, that living organisms function by a series of rules, by a theory. And this theory, this biological theory, I believe is control theory. And I think as I explain it, you'll be able to evaluate in your own mind whether it makes sense to you. Now, whatever we are because of this theoretical way we've led ourselves to become. And the control theory explains, I think very accurately, pretty much everything you'll see going on that human beings participate in, and all our actions and all our feelings and everything else. And reality therapy then is a procedure, a counseling technique that attempts to help us, however we are, to function more effectively. So control theory explains how we function now, and reality therapy is an attempt to help us to improve upon that functioning if we want to. And a counselor using reality therapy has a technique, I think a reasonably powerful technique, to encourage people to attempt to improve upon their functioning, to take more responsibility for their lives, and to understand that they have a great deal of, and I'll use this word quite a bit today, even though I haven't explained it yet, they have a great deal of control over their lives if they wish to exert it. One of the main complaints of many people, especially young people, many of you counsel children and young people, they'll complain of the fact that they seem helpless against all the forces kind of arrayed against them. And of course, this belief I'm helpless is a very detrimental belief, because I think that most of us are not nearly as helpless as we may think we are if we could understand, or if we could get some good counseling to point us in directions where we might go and become more effective. So in general then, I'll talk certainly about reality therapy today, and I'll talk about control theory, and I'll explain how these two are really intertwined. But first I'd like to spend some time talking about this control theory, which is how we function. Because it's not a theory that's up in the sky kind of a thing that's just very theoretical. It's very practical, very usable, very understandable in terms of your life as you live it every day, and in terms of your whole biology, of which your psychology is really just a part, probably the most important part, but still just a part. Now, the first concept of control theory is something you probably haven't thought much about, and is really, from a conceptual standpoint, very, very simple, absurdly simple. And yet it may be the most difficult idea to begin, if you want to, if you believe what I'm saying makes sense, to begin to put to work in your life. Simple as it is, we've spent a lifetime, in a sense, not believing it. And it's best illustrated, perhaps, for instance, here on this little table beside me, there were a telephone, and it rang. And when it rang, I picked up, talked for a moment, and hung up. And then I asked you a very simple question. I asked you, why did I pick up the telephone? Why did I pick up that instrument and put it to my ear? And I think that, of course, by now you suspect, of course, that there is a trick answer here, which there is to some extent. But if you didn't suspect anything, most people would say, I picked the phone up because it rang. Or to use another similar analogy, suppose that I were driving with you in your car and we came to a traffic light and you stopped, and I asked you, why did you stop the car? And you pointed at the traffic light and say, the light just turned red. I always stop at red lights. Again, you believe that you stopped the car because the light turned red, and you tend to believe, as most people do without much thinking about it, that you answer a telephone because it rang. And we could go through a whole bunch of other examples of a similar nature. And what all of these beliefs, really all of them, stand for is the idea that our behavior, and I'll talk much more about behavior in just a moment. Right now I'll use the word without explaining it. I'll just say our behavior, like picking up the phone is certainly a behavior, stopping a car is a behavior, that our behavior is caused by events outside of us, that things go on in the world that cause our behavior. This is believed almost 100% around the world, that I can do something to you or for you that will cause you to behave in a certain way. And most human interaction is based upon this belief. If a child is doing badly in school, we can do something to stimulate him to learn, to stop behaving badly. That's inherent within the human condition. And yet control theory, this theory which I'll be explaining to you all day along with reality therapy, says this isn't so. That no one does anything, not one single thing has ever been done by any living creature, and control theory applies to bacteria and trees and snails and rabbits as well as human beings. It's a theory which explains the behavior of all living creatures. That no living creature does anything because of what goes on outside that creature. That all of our behavior, and again, as I say, I'll explain our behavior in more detail as we go along. But literally, just to say now briefly, everything we do, everything we think, everything we feel, and all of our physiology, all of which could be considered components of our behavior, all of these occur because of what goes on inside of ourselves. Now, why do I pick up the phone? Why do you? Why do all of us pick up the phone? If we look at this behavior, this rather simple behavior, do we always pick up the phone? does that ring of the phone always cause us to reach out and pick it up? And the answer is no, it doesn't. If you'll examine this action, which is taken for granted in most cases and not examined, but if you'll examine it now in your mind, you'll see that whenever you pick up the phone under all conditions, and the same as stopping at a red light, and we could give other examples, it would all be the same, it's always a choice. You choose to pick up the phone and you choose to stop at a red light. Now, you don't always choose to answer the phone. So the ring is merely something that calls your attention to the fact that at this time, I might make a choice. And the choice could be to answer the phone, which is commonly the choice, or to let it ring. And the choice is always made based upon some idea inside of you, which at this time is most prevalent inside of you, which might say, I have something better to do than answer the phone, or might say that I believe, just guess that there's someone there I don't want to talk to right now, so I'll let the phone ring. And so it's always based upon whether you believe that what you may choose to do in a simple situation like this, or as we'll go on later this morning in much more complicated situations, it's always based upon your belief of whether or not this particular behavior will be the most satisfying to you. Now, it's a guess. You don't know. It might not be that person on the phone that you expect. You might miss an important call or something like that. But nevertheless, all of our behavior and all of the behavior of all the people that you deal with is based upon what that person believes is the best choice at the time. Therefore, if you're called to counsel a child who doesn't read, we have a lot of fancy explanations for why children don't read. They call, because it sounds more intelligent, intellectual, sometimes we use the Latin word, which means we don't know what the heck we're talking about. We say dyslexia or something like that. A child doesn't read ordinarily, maybe not a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, but when you get up to 8 or 9 years old, doesn't read because he doesn't believe that reading will satisfy him at this particular time as much as not reading. And that seems foolish to us, most of us believe in reading, but the child doesn't. So the reason he doesn't read is the same reason you might choose not to answer a telephone, or you might choose at times to go through a red light. Suppose someplace out in the country they'd erected a red light on a lonely road, but there it was, and it was red, and you drove up to it and stopped because you have, most of us, the idea inside of us, I'll be safe. I'll have a better chance to stay alive if I stop at a red light. That's inside you. But the red light, you don't know it, but it's broken. Doesn't turn green. And you wait, there's no traffic there. How long would you wait? How long would you stand there and let that red light control you? Well, depending upon your own degree of caution. Most of us, however, in half an hour or so, we'd venture through. We're not going to stand and starve to death at that red light. A machine would. I mean, a telephone answering machine is dead. It always answers the phone. It doesn't care what is said to it. It just answers and accepts any message offered because it's a machine. And all machines are externally controlled. There are no machines that have any sense of internal purpose whatsoever. But living creatures all have purpose. And all of our life is to satisfy the purpose. Now, we might not, I'll explain to you what I believe is the purpose of all human beings, whom I know most of all. You might not believe in what I say. That's because my idea of our purpose may differ from yours, but regardless of whether we agree upon the purpose, I think that as you think this thing through, it'll become apparent that we all have purpose. So that child who chooses not to read in school and seems not to be able to comprehend these little curlicues, which are the Roman letters in the English language, that child has said to himself, right now, making an effort to read will not satisfy my purpose. And he doesn't make the effort. And so what we have to do as counselors, if it's part of your job as a counselor to help encourage the child to make an effort to learn to read, which he can do, all people practically can learn to read. He doesn't read. you have to somehow or other get through to him that it will satisfy his purpose if he does make an effort and does learn to read. But for many children, incomprehensible as it may seem to us in the United States, for literally millions of children, it has not satisfied their purpose. And they don't read, and we have huge societies and organizations all struggling to explain that the child is defective and can't read. But yet when they find out that when they take these defective children and they put them in these special schools where they're treated very well, where they like to be, where their purpose is satisfied, then the children learn to read, and they say it has been miraculously cured. Well, they haven't unstraightened, messed up neurons or anything. They've just helped the child to understand that reading will now satisfy my purpose in this particular situation. In fact, I have a woman whom I'm going to meet with when I get back to Los Angeles, who's done some research to show that if you take non-reading children who are said to be neurologically damaged, something I've never believed in whatsoever, and you teach them how to use a simple word processing program on a computer, that within 90 days they learn to read. These are 13 and 14-year-olds who haven't read. That within 90 days they can read as well, so that when they're tested, their testing can't be distinguished from children who've always read. Now, what does a computer give them? Well, again, we'll get back to this, but a computer gives them a certain degree of control over the language that can't be gotten in any other way. I don't know how many of you know how to do word processing, but you have almost a miraculous control over the language when you can learn actually to process it with a computer. And with this control, which is what all living creatures are attempting to really have as they live, all of us are attempting to control our lives. And if reading gives us control over our lives, we'll want to read. And that means, again, if we follow this theory, that those children who don't read have made the decision that reading will not increase my control over my life. If anything, if I make the effort and fail again as I have up till now, it'll probably decrease the control. Excuse me. It's better not to make the effort than to make the effort and not get much out of it because I really believe I can't. You see, this idea of control is very important. So, what internal purpose do we satisfy by answering a telephone? Well, most of us like to socialize with other people, and the telephone is a very safe way to socialize. Many of us are even afraid to confront a person face to face. We'll first venture a phone call or something like that. It's easier. And so most of us, all human creatures, like to socialize and to belong. It's one of, I believe, the forces that drive us, which I'll talk about in a little bit in more detail. And so we answer the phone because it's very satisfying to talk to someone who would like to talk to you. But if you suspect that the person, on the other hand, will be a person that you don't want to talk to, well, then you wouldn't satisfy that purpose, and so you'd often choose not to answer the phone. And certainly all living creatures don't want to socialize and belong. Many of them don't. Certainly lower creatures. But all living creatures want to struggle to stay alive. That's built into us also. And so we stop at a red light because it's a very, very sensible thing to do if you want to stay alive. And we all of us learn that. But under certain emergency situations, or stuck out in the country with a broken light, we'll go through. The light doesn't determine our action. Our action is determined by the choice inside of us. Will it be better to stay at this light if I'm bleeding copiously right now, or take a chance and go through and rush to the hospital where they'll stop the bleeding? Well, of course, under those circumstances, most people would disregard the red light. It would have little control over them and say, I'm not going to stand here and bleed to death. You'll blow your horn and carefully go through the intersection and get to the hospital, just like ambulances sometimes go through red lights because they have a sick person in them or things like that. So again, the red light's a part of the world. But living creatures, all of us, attempt to deal with the world in the best way we can to control it. I don't mean dominate it, I mean just to control it, like you control your car and things like that. To satisfy some current purpose inside of yourself. In contrast to the general psychology of the world, which is we can control people by doing things to them or for them or threatening them or scaring them. And this general psychology of the world has a name. It's been researched to a great extent. It's called stimulus response psychology. And it holds that certain stimuli out there can be created and that people will respond to them in certain very predictable ways. Well, the problem with stimulus response psychology, as well as you can predict fairly well how people will deal with certain events in the world, because we all are the same creatures, you can never predict 100%. You can only predict how a person will behave if you know what's going on within the person. Then you can predict their behavior, but you can never know exactly what's going on within a person. The only person whom you know what's going on inside that person is yourself. And you'll never know what's inside another person, but certainly we can guess, and guess pretty accurately. If I know you're hungry and I offer you dinner, I can pretty well predict you'll eat, because I have learned what hunger is, and I know you're telling me how hungry you are, and all these things. And so much of our behavior is relatively predictable, but never 100%. This is why the animal psychologists who try to predicate, this is where Pavlov went wrong. He thought the dog salivated because he rang the bell. The dog salivated because it was hungry. And Pavlov used dogs. Had Pavlov used cats, he never would have got nothing. There's no cat in the world that will stand around and salivate because someone rings a bell. The cat would have looked at Pavlov like he was crazy, because cats aren't hungry all the time. They have very small and finicky appetites. They have other things on their mind. And so if you attempt to deal with a cat as you would a dog, you'll be very, very disappointed. This is why they tend to use animals like pigeons and rats, because their behavior is rather predictable. Their wants, their internal purpose is rather predictable. When you start doing behavior modification with humans, you fail almost totally and completely, and it becomes ridiculous as you struggle in constant ways to figure out what will satisfy children. Then they get onto it and they play games with you, and the whole thing becomes an exercise in futility. We can't control people externally. It's never been done successfully. Now, we try to, though. We've never given that up. We're still trying to. We're building in the United States and Russia thousands and thousands of atomic weapons to control the other side. But if we use the weapons, then of course we'll lose control. So it's a very chancy thing, but it doesn't stop people from trying. If people would understand control theory and understand that all of us have internal purpose, we would then be able to make, I think, a much more effective kind of an effort to deal with people and with problems and things like that. This external business has been a disaster and always will be. Well, let me give you a psychological example of control theory to carry this into the counseling realm, perhaps even a little more than the kid who can't read. Man came to me for counseling a while back when I don't have much of a practice. This is when I had a bigger practice. And he had made an appointment. He came in. It was a young man, maybe in his early 30s. I couldn't tell how old he was, but he was well dressed and presented himself well. But to look at him, my appraisal was, just when I first looked at him, when he walked in the office, he looked upset. And so I said to him, whatever you say when someone first walks in, everybody has a little different. I said to him, well, tell me, what's on your mind? And he said, flat out, he said, Doctor, I'm depressed. Now that's a perfectly reasonable reason to see a counselor. Probably in terms of voluntary counseling, where people go to seek help, it's probably by far and away the main reason that people go. I'm depressed. Now, when he said that to me, I knew a lot of things about him because I know control theory. I knew, first of all, that he was going to tell me that somebody out there had done him wrong, because it was unlikely that he'd come and complain about his car, his refrigerator, his TV set. People don't come to counselors for that. They come about people. And he was in his early 30s, and my experience is that people in their early 30s don't come complaining about girlfriends. It'd be a wife. That's who it would be. And so when he said, I'm depressed, I knew immediately he's having problems with his wife. Well, unlikely. Could be his brother, sister, his mother, but that's very unlikely. My guess is it would be his wife, and my guess is that she'd done something he didn't like. And I also knew that although he was going to complain that his wife, because I could guess that right off the bat, was the cause of his trouble, that she wasn't. That he was the cause of his trouble. I knew something that I would have to teach him very slowly and carefully, or he'd leave my office saying I was some kind of a fool. I had to teach him he was choosing a behavior which could best be called depressing. He was choosing to depress as his best way of dealing with his wife. Just like stopping my car is my best way of dealing with a red light, and answering the phone is ordinarily the best way of dealing with a ringing phone, he was choosing to depress. Now, he didn't know that. He thought that his misery was caused by her. Now, this is all my guesswork, and it goes through my mind in 2 seconds after I see him. So I said, oh, tell me your story. And he said, well, he said, doctor, he said, I'm a married man, and when I live home with my wife, we have no children. We've been married about 4 years, and she's a lot younger than me. He said, I'm in almost, about 34, and she's about 23. We've been married about 4 years. He said, and I thought we were getting along pretty well. We both work. We financially were doing well. We're planning a family a little bit later. But he said, I came home from work a week ago, and she wasn't there, and she's usually home ahead of me. She works a little shorter hours. And I waited for her, and she didn't show up. Long past when she'd be home. She might have gone shopping, but this was about 6:30. Usually home by about 5 o'clock. She didn't come, and I began to wander around the house as people do when they're at loose ends. And then I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Using one of those little magnets, she had pinned to the refrigerator a little note. 2 words, so long. That was it, he said. And when I saw that note and realized that she'd left, and I ran to her bedroom and certainly saw her personal belongings had all been removed, and she left. And he said, well, since that time, doctor, I've been so upset, so distraught, so depressed, so immobilized, I haven't even left the house. Friends of mine who work with me, I've been sitting home a week, they came over and they said, look, you're in such bad shape, you should get some counseling. And so they suggested I see you, and so here I am. Well, that was his story. And pretty much verified what I suspected, that he thought that he'd been put into this misery by his wife, that he had nothing to do with it. She made him this way. And if this were true, which it couldn't be true, of course, but if it were true, then I couldn't help him if it were true. If it were true, the only way I could help him is get his wife back. I have no way to get his wife back. I don't even know his wife. And so I have to help him to choose a more effective behavior to deal with this situation. Then these are now control theory terms which you'll get used to as I use them, then depressing or miserabling or whatever he was doing. But he doesn't understand any of this, and so I got to teach it to him, slowly, of course, because if I teach it too fast, it'll be upsetting. So I said, well, I can't believe that she could have left just from a clear blue sky. I mean, there must have been some difficulty between you. And he said, yes, we'd been having some problems. I said, what problems? He says, well, she'd been unhappy. I said, about what? Well, she was dissatisfied with the direction the marriage was going. I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, well, she was saying that she ought to have more say in the way things were going on in this house, about what we should do and our plans and everything else. And I was telling her that I could plan everything okay, and that she should just accept what and he says, because I was older than her and I have more experience and everything else. And he said, I never suspected that she would just up and leave. And I said, well, the fact is that she has, so she was probably more unhappy than you believed. He says, yeah. He says, I wish she'd come back. I like her back. And then he told me all the things he would do to amend his ways. He would listen to her more and let her have some of the input on how the marriage was going to go and the plans they're going to make. He really, at this point, was thinking maybe he ought to change. But he was telling it to me, which is okay, but I'm not married to him, so it wasn't doing an awful lot of good. But anyway, he's saying it. So I hear this whole story, and when you counsel a while, some of you have counseled, I'm not sure longer than others, when you're, I've counseled quite a while, when you're young and strong, which you are at the beginning of counseling career, you like to listen to misery, and you usually listen a long time. But when you get older and not so strong, you decide you don't want to listen to a great deal of misery. The world is tough enough without hearing too much of it. And so at this stage of my life, I have kind of a little rule. I'll listen to misery about 20 minutes. That's about enough. You can hear a lot of misery in 20 minutes, and I'm a compassionate person, and I tend to choose to be miserable along with it if I hear too much, and I don't want to do that. So after 20 minutes, I said, okay, I get the picture. I get the picture. Now, I said, let me recapitulate just to make sure I understand. And I just simply recapitulated what he'd been saying. I said, your wife left about a week ago and you'd like her back. You'd like to try and work out the problems in this marriage. And he said, yes, he would. I said, and from what I understand, if what you've told me is accurate, since she's left, you've chosen to sit home and chosen not to go to work. Is that correct? Well, he didn't jump to the affirmative at that particular point. There was something wrong with my recapitulation. And what was wrong with it was the very, very important and good reality therapy word, which if you learn reality therapy, you'll start to incorporate in your counseling vocabulary. It was the word chosen. He didn't like that word. He said, doctor, he said, you don't understand. I haven't chosen to sit home. I haven't chosen not to go to work. You see, he's a stimulus response person like Pavlov and everybody else. He has no understanding of control theory, but I'm going to teach him some. He doesn't realize it, but I'm going to. And he's telling me that he didn't choose it. And so I interrupted him. I said, wait a second, I said. How can you tell me now? I said, who lives home? He said, just my wife and I. I said, for the last week. He said, just me. I said, well, how can you tell me? I said, no dogs or cats, nothing? He says, no, nothing. I said, how could you tell me you haven't chosen to sit home? Because you just told me you have. And then, cranking up some more anguish to impress me, he said, well, doctor, he said, if you put it that way, I suppose you could say I've chosen to sit home. And then he said, but doctor, and all of us have said this, I mean, this is a very common stimulus response statement that we all use. Doctor, I've been so upset, what else could I do? Now, when we say that, we've all said that, I'm so upset, what else could I do, when you miserabled away for a while. You're expecting, if you have any kind of a compassionate listener, that he would say to you, well, in that situation, I'm surprised you're doing as well as you are. I mean, that's what we want. But of course, I'm a counselor. I'm not there to tell him what he wants to hear. I'm there to try to teach him a little bit about how he's choosing to deal with his life right now. And so I said to him, if you ask me what else you could do, although this isn't your problem, I think you could go to work. I don't understand how staying home from work, what's that doing for you? Well, you see, it is doing something for him. But he doesn't understand it, but he's beginning to get a little inkling of what's going on. Of course staying home from work is doing something for him. Why does he stay home from work? You're not control theorist, but you know to some extent why he stayed home from work. He wants to impress the world generally, but someone specifically, with how miserable he is. Suppose his wife, for some reason, calls work. She may need something from him, and finds out he's home, and here's he's so miserable he can't come to work. If she has any care or concern for him, mightn't she then come home or something like that? Whenever we choose misery, which all of us are expert in choosing, we do so in the hopes it will control someone important to us. Now, since I'm not really easily controlled in that situation, it doesn't control me, but he would hope it was, and that's why he's even cranking up this anguish to me and saying, oh, you don't understand, you're just very, very abrupt with me and things like that. So he said, what else could I do? I told him he could go to work. And he thought it over. And he said, yeah, you're right. There's no sense sitting home. I said, you have a good job? You told me people come from work that are your friends. He said, yes, I have a very good job. I said, well then, if your problem has to do with your wife, how's sitting home going to help? He says, well, it isn't. I mean, he could see the foolishness of his position at that particular time. Yet up till that moment, staying home from work seemed to him the thing to do. But then he said, no, I'm going to go to work. It's boring sitting home. I said, I imagine it is. I said, besides that, I said, you say you're miserable, and I don't disagree with you. Sometimes if you can get away from this misery by going to work where you have friends and do something, could be better. He says, yeah, I'll go to work. Now, then we went on to the next part. I said to him, but look, you didn't come to me because you have a job problem, although certainly I think you'll agree it'd probably be better to go to work. What I wanted to teach him, and I was beginning to teach him this too, was that he has some choice in what he does with his life, that his wife isn't making him stay home, nor is his misery making him stay home. He's choosing to stay home. And with this, maybe we ought to take a look at our behavior in a little more detail than most of us tend to look at it. The word behavior, and what he's doing is behaving. All the things he's doing is behaving. I think that, and this may take a little teeny bit of effort on your part to look at things this way, but if you'll examine living creatures, be they bacteria or snails or trees or cats or monkeys or people, all living creatures, you'll find that the only thing that any living creature can do is behave. That's all that we can accomplish, is our behavior. And so anything which we generate from within us is a behavior. Therefore, when he came to the office and announced, I'm depressed, that's a behavior. It came from within him. Our feelings are certainly a component of our behavior. And so what I'd like to introduce now is perhaps a new idea, not a complex idea, but a new one, the concept of total behavior. That all behaviors that we see, that we engage in, what I'm doing now, what you're doing now, is a total behavior of some kind or other. And a total behavior means it's made of components. And as best as I can figure out, and I've done a lot of thinking about this, and no one really has refuted this, that all behavior, all human behavior, lower creatures not capable of as much behavior as humans, but all human behavior is made up of 4 components, all of which we generate from within ourselves, and all of which, if you add them up, becomes our total behavior. Now, this is a stand of some kind here, and it has 4 legs supporting it. And if we can look at the stand and it's functioning as a stand, as a total behavior, then it's easy perhaps to see that each leg could be a component of the behavior. If I chop off one leg, the stand won't work. It'll topple. It won't function as a stand. So for any behavior to be a behavior, it has to have all 4 components, just like the stand has to have 4 legs for it to function as a stand. Now the difference between, where the analogy breaks down a little bit, is that in the stand, all the legs are equal, because that's the most sensible way to design a stand. But the stand would work just as well if this leg was very thick and that leg were thinner. It wouldn't make any difference. It would still work as a stand. So when we say our behavior is always made up of 4 components, the components themselves can be present in different amounts. And the components of our behavior are certainly what we do, our activity, like I'm waving my hands now, that's a physical component. Walking, running, sitting, any of these physical behaviors are part of our behavior. The thinking component, thinking what I'm going to say, is certainly, and you're thinking perhaps about what I'm saying now, every behavior has some sort of thought. Even the most automatic behavior has some mental thought component to it, even though that component may be very tiny, as in the case of what you think about when you walk across the room, which is almost automatic. But when you learn to walk, you thought considerable about it. And if you ever have a stroke or something and have to learn to walk again, you'll find there's a tremendous amount of thinking in learning a simple behavior like walking. Then every behavior has a feeling component. Some behaviors have almost no feeling attached to them, and some have a tremendous amount of feeling. So that component can be large or small. When he came to my office and said, "Doctor, I'm depressed," what he was really describing to me was the feeling component of a total behavior, which had an action. He had walked into the office, a thinking, I'll see this psychiatrist and get some counseling. And so the feeling component can be large or small. Now, we tend as counselors to focus a great deal upon the feeling component of total behavior, but we should never neglect the other components. They're equally important. And every behavior has a biologic, and I prefer to call it, because it's all biologic, a physiologic component. And when you're depressed, you have certain physiologic things are going on inside you, certain neurochemistry and neurobiology and all these things they talk about, which certainly does go on, and your physiology is always appropriate to or compatible with any total behavior. Now, since we live in a stimulus response world, and since my profession, medicine, is an amazingly stimulus response profession, and medicine messes a little bit with the psychology every once in a while, you see, and if this were a group of medical doctors, there would already be some doctors getting a little bit, choosing to nervous a little bit as I say this, and say, well, you say that depressing's a behavior, but isn't it caused by a neurochemical upset or something like that? Well, your neurochemistry, whatever that is, and goodness knows, don't worry about it, is always appropriate to the behavior, but it doesn't cause it. Now, that's tricky because most of you believe it does, and you've been led to believe it does to some extent. I can explain this leg of this stand here doesn't cause that leg. It's a leg of the stand. Let me explain it another way. Suppose that you're an exercise addict and you go out and do a lot of running on a very hot summer day. You maybe run 10 kilometers or something like that. And then you come in to the house and perhaps go to embrace your wife or your husband. They might say, "Go away, don't come near me." You say, "Why?" Because you smell and you're sweating. Now, you see, follow the same analogy. It sounds ridiculous, I suppose, to say it, but you see, your sweating didn't cause you to run. Your sweating is the physiology associated with the activity of running. You always sweat. It's perfectly normal. In fact, if you didn't, you'd die after you sweat to cool your body off. But any more than the biochemistry that goes on inside your head causes your depression. It doesn't. It's compatible with your depressing. It's not the same. If you had a way to check out your biochemistry in some way, you would find that if you could check it out, and there is ways to check it out, that when you depress, it's different from when you're happy. Just like when you're sitting quietly in the house, you don't sweat, because sweating doesn't go along with sitting quietly. It goes along with running. So one doesn't cause the other. I have an old-time client of mine I've been seeing for 100 years, and he subscribes to the American Medical Journals, Time and Newsweek, and he reads those very assiduously because they always have a medical section. And he's an expert depressor. He's been depressing for 60 years, he claims. And so he came in clutching Time magazine. You have it in Ireland, Time magazine? It's kind of a magazine without too much accuracy, but it's a popular magazine. Anyway, he says, look what Time magazine says, because I've been telling him he's choosing his misery all this time. He doesn't believe it. He says, Time says that I'm suffering from a disease called depression. Doctors call it a disease. And I've been telling you it's a disease. I says, well, I don't believe that, but what does Time say? I'm not, I'm impressed that Time would call it a disease. What does it say? He says, well, it says it's caused by a neurochemical upset. I says, does Time say how to cure it? Oh, yeah, they got medicines. I said, well, you've taken all those medicines given you by other doctors. These other doctors besides me to get the medicine. He says, why don't you continue taking them? He says, they make me feel awful. I said, when you mess around with your brain, usually doesn't do too good. The only medicine that he enjoys is a little marijuana, which isn't prescribed by his doctors. Anyway, the thing is, what the article said is, you can prove that you've got this. There's a blood test for it. What he wanted was the blood test. I said, well, why don't you get it? He said, you need a doctor's prescription. I said, I'll prescribe it for you. Where do you get it? He says, well, you get it in Beverly Hills, which is an expensive place, because they have everything first in Beverly Hills, if it's expensive. I said, well, he happens to be a multimillionaire. I said, well, you've got the money, hell, spend it. I said, find out if you got this disease. He says, yeah, he says, I'll spend it. It was a couple of $100. And he says, my insurance won't cover it. He says, no, it won't cover for any test they give in Beverly Hills. I can guarantee you that. He says, oh, hell, I'll spend it anyway. I said, sure, it'd be interesting to know that I've been wrong all this time and that they're right and you got this disease. Even if they can't cure it, it would be nice to know. And so I said, on the other hand, I said, knowing the man is a skinflint, I said, what the hell? I said, $200 is a lot of money. You don't want to just throw that down the drain. I said, let me write on the prescription. You never know about these laboratories. Let me write down on the prescription blank, plenty of room at the bottom. Let me write down that if you score the highest they've had on this test this year in that lab, you get it free. And he looked at me and he said, you think I'll get that high? I said, how could you miss? I said, you've been depressed for 60 years. There's nobody coming in that's been depressed as long as you have. He's been 65, so he's been depressed for at least 60 of those years, he claims. I says, you're the most miserable guy in town. You're going to get the best score they've ever seen. And then he says, well, he says, he's not so dumb. That's why he has all these millions of dollars. He says, if I'm going to get that high a score, why should I take the test? I said, you're the one that came with the article, not me. I said, what they're testing for is what you got. I said, you have, and this is, they test for circulating cortisols, which come out of your adrenal gland when you're upset. It's just what the normal physiology of being miserable. And they test for it, and they charge $200. It's like going to a doctor when you're running, coming in from running, and say, doctor, check me and see if I'm sweating. It's exactly the same thing. It doesn't, the cortisols don't cause the misery. The misery is caused because this is a lonely guy. And I'm his only friend in the world. I'm his only close friend in the whole world. Nobody else is his friend. And so he says, I feel good when I'm around you. I said, of course, because, when I don't see him in the office anymore. Hell, we play tennis together. It'd be too boring to listen to his misery. But he's a good tennis player, and we play tennis. He says, I feel good now. I says, well, don't go to Beverly Hills now. You'll flunk the test. You see, your physiology is always, your behavior is always appropriate. Think of your behavior, another good way to think of it is like the four wheels on a car. And your life is determined by the direction you drive the car, and the wheels are all of your behavior to get there. So the back wheel doesn't cause the front wheel. All the wheels go, so if you want to answer a phone, you drive your car in that direction. And if you are lonely and you want to be among people, but you won't drive your car among people, then you'll drive your car in the direction away from people, and then you'll depress. That's the behavior that takes you away from people. So think of this as total behaviors. One doesn't cause the other. These are all appropriate and understandable in any situation. And so when you read in the paper about miracle cures, which you do read about, sometimes a person miraculously cured of arthritis or cancer, some of these dread diseases, what happened? Well, these diseases are behaviors too. All diseases are behaviors. No diseases, they say, are caused by organisms, but they're not. Any doctor that's got any sense, if you go to the medical school and talk to the people who really know something in the medical school, they'll explain to you, if you're a medical student, most medical students never learn this, but it's taught to them, that all diseases are how you deal with whatever comes along. So tuberculosis may be in the air, but everybody doesn't catch it. Those people who can deal with it adequately, they deal with it and never catch it. Those people who are susceptible to it or perhaps weak and undernourished, they can't deal with it, and so their disease is how they deal with it. Well, anyway, the point is, when you read about a miracle cure, it's always accompanied by a person who has, if you'll examine their life, has taken control of their life at this particular time. And so miracle cures are not really miracles. When you take control of your life, like when this man who's miserable plays tennis with me and says, I really enjoy it, we ought to play more often, he's taken control of his life. He likes to play tennis. He then changes his whole physiology at that particular point. And so these are all spin-offs of control theory, which I'm just mentioning now, so you can understand that we are biologic organisms, and that our biology is related to the direction we take our life. So if you have a little child who's failing in school and miserable and acting out and doing all the upsetting things to himself and everybody else, that's the direction he's steering his whole car. And his activity is one wheel, and his misery is another wheel, and his unwillingness to work in school, and his thinking, I won't work in the school, another wheel, and whatever his physiology is, which is appropriate to that. And if you're going to help the child, you have to help him to change his total behavior, to move in a new direction. Well, that's what I do with this patient. So we went on at that point to help him change his total behavior. I had begun to do this by pointing out to him he could choose to go to work. Now, if you'll think of the front wheels of the car, the wheels that steer the car, and the back wheels follow, this isn't totally accurate, but it's reasonably accurate. The components of your behavior over which you have the most voluntary or arbitrary control are what you do and what you think. And so if you do and think something and change those, what you feel and the physiology tends to follow reasonably well. So keeping that in mind, I said to this man, well, your problem isn't work. You can go to work. That's no real problem. The problem is your wife. She's left you. That's what you came to me to get help with, isn't it? He says, yes. And so I said, well, let's look at that now. Let's talk about that. You want your wife back? He said, yes, I do. Why do you want his wife back? Because, as I'll explain a little bit, all of us have a need for love and belonging, and when she left, he was lonely. And so I said, tell me, how is sitting home as you've been doing for the past week, how is that going to help you get your wife back? Now, it did, to some extent, he thought, be an effective behavior. It was, to some extent, an effective behavior. It hadn't worked, but it's the behavior most of us choose when we're disappointed by someone else. We all tend to depress a little bit, and sometimes a lot, in the hopes that if we choose misery, the other person will be compassionate if they care for us and come back and pat us on the head and say, cheer up and don't be miserable, and things like that. Even my dog knew how to do that. She had no difficulty. The dog was an expert depressor. Whenever we'd leave the house, my wife and I, she would come to the front door with us and say, where are we going? And I'd say, we're going out and you're staying home. And she'd say, why? And I'd say, because where we're going, they don't like dogs. And she'd say, I'll sit in the car. That's the one thing she always says. Says, no, you're staying home. And as soon as she heard that, she would then go low on the floor. It was a big dog. She would get so low on the floor you could run a vacuum cleaner over. You wouldn't even touch the dog. And my wife would say, don't look at her. Because if you looked at her, and she was, everything. I mean, her eyes turned down, her mouth drooped. And she was so totally, abjectly miserable. Did she choose that? Of course she chose it. Why did she choose it? Because she knew it would control us. And about half the time, either my wife or I would say, oh, well, let her come. Now, the dog didn't have the decency to continue to be depressed for a little while. The dog would immediately jump to life and start to joy immediately and say, okay, and things like that. And then, of course, when we got where we were going, she'd say, I'll come in the house, I'll be good. I'd say, no, and then she'd go through the same thing. We left her in the car. But the point is, dogs are perfectly capable of depressing, and they're perfectly capable of joying. They have a wide range of emotion, which they use, but doesn't happen to them. They learn it, and they choose it. And where did we learn it? Hell, we learned it when we were little teeny children. We learned that when we chose misery, it would have a powerful controlling effect on our parents. I was watching the children's parade yesterday right outside of my hotel, and a lot of little kids were crying. I mean, not the kids in the parade, but little kids. You got a lot of little kids around, and they're crying. Why are they crying? They'd chosen to cry because things weren't going their way. And if they then get their way when they cry, they learn this has a value. Now, as you grow older, you don't cry because that's kind of overdoing it, so you just learn to mope and depress. And that's what this guy was doing. He was hoping his wife would find out how miserable he was. But after a week, he was beginning to realize it wasn't working. And so I said, I didn't talk to him about his moping. I just talked about the part of his behavior over which he has the most arbitrary control, sitting home. I said, is sitting home, has that helped you get your wife back? And he says, no, it hadn't worked. And he said, but I don't know what else to do. Now, in counseling, in reality therapy, you focus upon the total behavior, which means you don't neglect the feeling, you don't neglect the thinking, you don't neglect anything. You focus on the total behavior. And we could say his total behavior was sitting home and miserabling. And so I focused at least upon the sitting home part. He had told me the miserabling part. Well, could I make a suggestion? It's perfectly okay in counseling, at least in reality therapy counseling, if a person says, what I'm doing isn't working. That's step 3, which we'll go into this afternoon, some of these steps. If what I'm doing isn't working, then it's perfectly okay to, and if they say I don't know what else to do, to suggest, well, maybe something that I could suggest will work. And so I said, well, could I make a suggestion? He said, yes. He said, what do you suggest? I said, I suggest you write her a letter. He said, well, what will I say? I said, very simple what you say. Tell her what you told me. Tell her how you'd like to change your ways, how you'd like to have another chance, how you would make the decisions more equally and not be so domineering and all these things. Explain that you'd overdone it and that you now realize, that it was wrong. I mean, tell her all this in a letter. And he said, that's a good idea. And and he said, I knew when she left that I shouldn't rush after her. I had the feeling maybe I'll just rush after her and drag her home, but I said that would be a big mistake. And I said, well, that's why I'm suggesting you write a letter. See, now, what's the advantage of writing a letter? In control theory terms, over a letter, she has control. When she gets the letter from him, she can read the letter, she can put it down, she can think about it. If he comes roaring in the door, yelling and begging or threatening or cajoling or whatever, she'd feel he's just trying to dominate the situation also. So writing a letter did make good sense, and he understood it. And so he came in the next day. I suggested he bring the letter and we'd look it over together just to make sure it was okay. And he came in the next day and he had this letter. It was a nice letter. I said, send it. And then I said to him, asked him, I said, how do you feel now? He said, I feel good. I said, I feel pretty good. I said, why do you feel good? He said, well, I think maybe things are going to work out. In other words, he had chosen a much more effective total behavior. Writing a letter is a much more effective total behavior than sitting home moping. And because it's more effective, Now you can begin to understand where in our biologic history over millions and millions of years our feelings have come from. Any feeling which gives us greater control over a situation than what we've had previously will tend to feel better than the previous feeling. Therefore, when he'd chosen a feeling to get control of moping and depressing and hadn't worked, he was willing to change to another behavior, and that behavior was more effective than sitting home. The feeling associated with it then becomes a more pleasurable behavior. So, pleasure and pain or misery, you're always moving kind of in one direction or another. And if your move is toward getting more of what it is you want, you'll feel better. When the dog gets to go with us when we don't want to take her, she feels great. She's gained control over a situation that previously was not within her control. And it's the same with all of us. Now, if the letter would work and his wife would come home and maybe actually he asked her to meet in my office and work out some of the details and things like that. If the letter would work, then writing a letter would be a much, much more effective behavior. But if he were going to recoup this marriage, he's going to have to figure out a whole series of different behaviors than he's been using for the past year or so with his wife that, in a sense, led her to choose the total behavior of leaving him. And so, but the better way to get things started was to write a letter than to sit around moping. Now, most of us don't choose the better way. We counsel people who have learned, most of the people we counsel, all of them actually, have learned the power of misery. And they don't want to give it up. Or they've learned the power of acting out for attention, or they've learned the power of not learning and not reading, which is a very powerful behavior if you want attention and you want support, you want the feeling you're somebody and all these things which are important to us. These miserable, painful, ineffective acting out behaviors, which are the substance of all of our abnormal psychology and diagnostic categories and all these things, they tend to be powerful behaviors. Now, and they're chosen. They're really chosen. We know them, we've learned them, and we choose them. Now, if you carry this further into something which becomes more difficult, how about craziness, psychosis, madness, whatever you want to call it? Schizophrenia is a word I don't use, but it's around. These are chosen also. Now, does a person choose to be crazy? Well, this gets very complicated, and I'll perhaps have time to explain today or not. But let me say that when a person is behaving in a crazy way, which means the thinking processes, the thinking component of the behavior is usually pretty much unusual and different and creative. That when a person is doing that, it's as if they can't figure out any better way. They feel as if they're locked in a room, and the only way out of the room is through craziness. And so one might say craziness is rather a forced choice. But if you ever worked with crazy people, and I have extensively, and they don't realize it when they're making the choice to be crazy. They have no realization that it just seems to them it's happening to them, just like it seems to you when you're depressing that it's happening to you. It doesn't seem as if you're choosing it. But I can tell you something you haven't bargained for, which has already happened, and it's too late to avoid it now. None of you in this room will ever depress as comfortably after today as you have up until today. You're going to begin to think, my goodness gracious, I am choosing some of this, aren't I? And I'm choosing it because it's easier than doing something more effective. I'm waiting to control someone else rather than doing something more effective to control my life than this particular choice. And so crazy people, they don't realize they're choosing their craziness, but the other way around, they always realize it. If you'll ask them, and I've asked many crazy people, I've worked with crazy people, helped them to do better and stop being crazy. This is not even very difficult to do. And so I've said, when did you decide not to be crazy anymore? And that they can answer. If you work with crazy people, ask them that question when they stop being crazy. They won't take it as anything, a bad intention or anything. And they'll tell you well, I just was getting along better and people cared about me here, and those ideas started to leave me, and I thought they'll really describe that they could now regain control of their life without the craziness in a therapeutic situation, which is a situation in which they could fulfill their needs more effectively. And psychosomatic illness, which is the primary illnesses of our culture and our society, are also illnesses that occur where the physiologic element of your life goes wrong when your life is out of control. This is very complicated, and perhaps we can get into it later this afternoon. I'd just like to mention, however, that this is the case, and that the so-called miracle cures are always when someone chooses a better total behavior, and the physiology then reverts to normal, which it will when we are in control of our lives. And so whenever you hear about someone that's lived a long and healthy life, it's because they figured out a way to be reasonably in control of their lives most of their life, whatever that way may be. If they believe in health food, then that'll work for them. So what health food stores sell is not health. No store can sell health. They sell control. And if you pay enough money for it, and if it's miserable enough tasting, it gives you the real sense of control and things like that. And so it doesn't make much difference as you live your life whether you eat high cholesterol or low cholesterol, all that kind of stuff. It'll all be eventually shown that what's important is, if your life is out of control seriously, then it's wise perhaps to eat less cholesterol and things like that. Don't push your body into more foolish behavior than it's doing now. But the kind of people who get heart attacks in control theory terms, their behavior would be called something that usually isn't called in paper and by doctors and things like that, but their behavior is heart attacking. That's their behavior. And doctors know all about this now. They don't call it that because it's hard to call it that, because it would give the patient too much voluntary control over his life, which doctors hate to really give them. But it really is heart attacking. And a prominent cardiologist in San Francisco, it's gone around the world now, have written books about it called Type A personality. And a Type A person is a person who drives his car in the direction of a heart attack. He's always a striving, competitive, never enough kind of a person, never relaxing, always trying to make more and get more and everything else. And when you do that, your physiologic wheel of your car, it starts to run past the red line. And these people self-destruct by never giving their bodies a chance to relax, because your body has to be constantly riled up. If you never settle down, you're always competing and struggling and striving. No, so they now say take it easy and things like that. What they're saying is get your life under more effective control. And if you go to a doctor, they have now, after a heart attack, they'll tell you that, and they now put new arteries in your heart, give you a fresh start and everything else. But they really also counsel you in most good cardiac recovery centers, change the way you're living your life, because if you don't, you'll corrode your new arteries just like you did your old. And many people who have suffered a heart attack, which is the end result of driving their car in the direction of heart attacking, they say, well, maybe I'll best change the direction I drive my car. And they'll drive it toward more rest periods, they'll get a regular exercise program, they'll eat more sensibly, but they'll stop the struggle which they're engaging in, the losing struggle, and say, well, I'll settle for a little less, it'll be okay too, if they can do that. If they can, they may live a long time and never get another heart attack. And so all of this, control theory is a biologic as much as psychologic. It's all part of your life. But the psychology, what you think and what you do, which are your major psychological behaviors over which you have control, these behaviors tend, if you can put those components in good shape, what you feel and your physiology will, like the rear wheels of a car, follow along. And generally, those are the areas that you look to. So when you counsel anybody and you ask people to tell you what they're doing and what they're thinking about, if you can help them to change these towards something more effective, you can pretty well be assured that if they move in a more effective direction, they'll feel better, and they'll also actually think they'll feel better, and their physiology will be better too. Well, keeping that in mind, what I haven't talked about, I'd like to turn to this chart now for a minute, and then I'd just like to explain a little bit of this, and then we can break for lunch. But I'd like to, before lunch, just go through one other important point here, which I've just talked about, but I'd like to talk about a little more thoroughly now. This chart says the basic concepts of reality therapy. It's an old chart, and I'm about ready to give it up, but it's still reasonably effective, and we can look at it. On the chart is a black dot in the top center of the chart. Maybe for the TV, I'll hold it up here. On the top center of the chart. And that denotes how the chart reads. It reads right and left from the black dot. And if you read to the right in that direction, you're going the direction of a more effective, a happier, more responsible. All the good words are on the right. And if you look toward the left on the chart, you'll see bad words like failure, weakness, not an effective control, and all those things. What this chart is attempting to show is that as we live our lives, we can live in any of the 5 positions that the people occupy on the chart, on a continuum on the left where it's failure, to the right towards success. And it starts in the middle because most of us kind of start there and then make our moves either toward more success or more failure. Now, below, there's a pain and pleasure graph, which are graphing the feeling wheel of the car. Whatever behavior you're choosing to move right or left, if you choose a behavior that moves you toward more success, you'll feel better. The feeling component of any of your total behaviors will be good feelings of some kind or other. If you move toward the left on the chart, you will tend, although there will be, even if you move toward failure, some pleasure along the way, your life will become increasingly involved with painful, miserable, unhappy, crazy, sick, and all the misery that's associated with the human existence. Until you get far to the left, where human beings have figured out through their ingenuity in almost every section of the globe, primitive or sophisticated, people have discovered that certainly there's a lot of loss of control and misery in every society, and people have discovered that if they take certain drugs and put them into the body, these drugs can fool your brain into thinking things are good when they're not, to thinking that you're in control of your life or not. And so an addicting drug is any drug that gives you chemically the feeling. It's an external thing. It comes in from the outside and becomes a part of your physiology, but it's really strange to you. It's external, foreign to you. It gives you the feeling you're in control. And how do you know you're in control of your life? What's the normal way we know? Well, again, it's how we feel. That's why we have feelings. Probably that's the reason they exist. Feelings tell you you're in control of your life. So any creature that can make choices will have feelings. I'm sure that pretty much works. If you take a tree has very little choice in how it lives its life, therefore probably has essentially no feelings. Its life is pretty much laid out for it by its simple genetic structure, whatever that may be. But as you go up, the dogs have choices and they have feelings. If they make bad choices, they'll feel badly. If they make good choices, they'll feel good. But all of our feelings are still the products of total behaviors, which are attempt to take control of our lives, just like when my dog chose to depress until she could control us, and then she chose to joy when she did. And she had us under pretty good control for most of the time that she lived with us. Now, what I haven't talked about, which I want to get into, is what drives the system. What is the purpose in our life? I've implied, certainly, that there is purpose, but let's go into it with some more detail, and then we can break for lunch. If I would say to you, what creates a human being? I think that most of you have had enough biology, because this is taught in biology courses, that we are the product of our genetic structure. That when an egg and a sperm meet, the basis for a new human being is formed at that moment. And that if you're going to have red hair or blue eyes or big feet or tall or short or whatever, that's all determined by your genes. In other words, your genes determine the way you're going to be, structurally. And nobody has any difficulty with that. In the medical school, they do a tremendous amount of teaching about how your genes determine your structures. And nowadays, they can genetically engineer certain little things to change things around, which is a field of some promise by changing the determinants of your structure. So the genes could be called the blueprints for the life that you're going to be. If you've got female genes, you'll become a woman. If you have male genes, you'll become a male, etc. There's no difficulty there. That's pretty much accepted. Would be a very unusual person who wouldn't believe in genes. Even people who don't believe in Darwin still believe in genes. I mean, people who are staunch anti-Darwinists still breed horses. In fact, that's the group that often does breed horses. And so the thing is, and they understand that if they breed horses, that they'll tend to breed their horses to winners, not to losers, to try and get winning genes and things like that. Now, that part is simple, but that's not what I want to focus on now. I want to focus on a part of our genetic structure that most people don't really accept or talk about or understand. And I have no way to prove what I'm saying is right. I just believe it to be so out of the fact that there's a lot of evidence that would establish what I say. But again, I can't say to you that this is anything more than I believe. I believe that the far more important part of our genetic structure is that in all species, be it a bacteria, snail, cat, dog, human being, your genes also determine the way that you must attempt to live your life. And human beings are no different from lower animals in that way. If you have a little koala, you know, the little animal that lives in Australia that they advertise, maybe you see the Qantas ads come on the TV, that little, you know what a little koala is, don't you? Well, that little animal has a genetic structure that will allow that animal only one choice as to food. It will only eat tender leaves from certain eucalyptus trees. That's why you don't see them in the zoos in most of the countries of the world, because you have to get the eucalyptus tree. They have to be flown from Australia since they're tender, the animals. They won't eat anything else. That isn't something they've learned. That's built into their genetic structure. They know that at birth. It's determined by their genes. Now here's a behavior. What they choose to eat. If it's not a eucalyptus leaf, they won't eat it. And they'll die of starvation, which they will. And if you get one here in the local zoo, it'll die in a few weeks, and that's it. You can't entice to eat anything else. So this is part of the evidence that says our genes determine not only our structure, but also much of our behavior is in a sense determined by our genes. Now, what human behavior is determined by our genes? Well, some human behavior is the same with all creatures. If we look at the center figure on the chart, that figure says security person. What I'm attempting to show here on the chart with this figure and with some other things which I'll talk about in a moment is that all human beings and probably all other living creatures are concerned about security, which is maybe more of a human concern. And let's say inside I have a little white figure, survival. We're all of us struggling to survive. Some of you have read Abraham Maslow's work, and he points out that survival is the basic human drive, because Maslow, like myself and even before me, talked about drives. I don't think he talked about them in terms of built into our genetic structure. I would like to talk about them as genetic instructions, that all of us are instructed genetically as to how we must attempt to live our lives. And following our genetic instructions, you would find it very difficult to just go drive your car just through a red light. Your genetic instructions would be putting pressure upon you to use a behavior that you know is safer, press the brake. You would find it very difficult just to move through this light. That's a genetic instruction. Very hard just to walk off a third-story porch or something like that, just step off into space. Very hard to put a gun to your head and press the trigger or something like that. None of us have much trouble with that as a genetic instruction. What we don't really understand is that with human beings, and here we begin to differ markedly from other creatures, with human beings, that's just one powerful instruction. It's not the overpowering instruction. With animals, it is. With animals, even higher animals, maybe maybe excluding whales and some of the higher apes. They may be more like us, but almost all, whales and porpoises that is, but almost all other animals have that as the overriding instruction. And how do I know that? I know that because human beings, and maybe a few whales and porpoises, and possibly, as I watch the TV, some of the apes that are depicted on the TV through the chimpanzee and ape studies, they will do something that we will do very blatantly, which is commit suicide. Now, I realize that that this is a difficult subject, especially in Ireland or something like that, but people do kill themselves, regardless of whether we like to talk about it or not. And they kill themselves, certainly, in disregard to their instruction to stay alive. So why would a person kill himself? Well, you never know if they've killed themselves. But people sometimes attempt to kill themselves and don't succeed. And as a psychiatrist, I was once asked to talk to a man who'd made the serious attempt but had not succeeded. And so I was called in and I said to him, well, why did you try to kill yourself? And he said, I was lonely. And it's well known, this is a psychological fact beyond any, I don't have to defend it, that most people who attempt suicide who don't succeed will tell you it was because they were lonely. And this man very well, under certain circumstances, might very well have attempted to take his own life when his wife left. This is not an unheard of situation under certain circumstances. Now, why would he do that? Well, sometimes it's so painful when you lose control of your life, and control of your life means your ability to satisfy these genetic instructions. It's so painful that you decide in a rational way. I'm certain it's not rational, although there could be some reason to it, but most people could usually do something better if they could get some help and some guidance. But nevertheless, they think it's the best thing they can do, and they try to kill themselves. And so this means that if we look at the arrows that run back and forth between the center figure and that larger figure at the right called fulfilled person, and that person on the right side of the chart is designated large because they're stronger. The size of the figure denotes the strength. As someone who's capable of satisfying all of our genetic instructions, but they're all like equally strong. And what we deal with are now the 4 psychological instructions. And the top one says belonging, loving, cooperation, caring, compassion. There's 1,000 words in the English language, at least, maybe more, that have to do with the satisfaction of that instruction that's built in at birth. A little baby doesn't have to learn that love is satisfying. A little baby knows it. You can pick up an infant child and nurture him and love him and hug him and kiss him and give him whatever we think are loving behaviors, and that child will, under most circumstances, be reasonably satisfied in many cases. And sometimes you can feed a child and do everything reasonable for a child but not love the child, and the child will be miserable, will choose to be miserable in his own little way. And if a child is cared for but not loved, the child will die. A little child will die. They'll die of a well-recognized disease called marasmus, which means that unloved, the physiologic wheel of their body becomes so out of kilter that they can't digest their food, and they begin to refuse to eat because their food gives them stomach pains, and they die of starvation, and it's called marasmus, and you can cure marasmus with simply love. 15 minutes a day of fondling will cure a marasmatic child. This has all been proved. A doctor named René Spitz in France even has movies on it. They used to take these babies in France and put them in orphanages where they gave them mechanical care but no love, and they all died. And Spitz came along and said, give them 15 minutes a day and they'll thrive. Well, I'm not sure they thrived, but they certainly didn't die. So the point is, this is a genetic thing. This is not something you have to learn about. And our genes aren't just set up for a little bit and then they go away. All of us need love all of our lives. Many children in school don't read because they're so unloved that they spend all their time and effort to get the love and attention, or at least the attention, if not the love, that they'll get by not reading. If they don't read, they get a tremendous amount more attention than if they do. So it's more satisfying to choose not to read and to do all these reversals and little crazy things they do with their letters and things as ways not to read to get the attention. If we discover the child sees half words or reverses words, we get all excited, and the child gains a tremendous amount of attention. So they discover this, and they enjoy our excitement and things like that, and they control us through the behavior of not reading, which gets them what they want. So you'll often find that the children who don't read are children who sometimes are unsatisfied, unable to satisfy this genetic instruction for love. But it perhaps is even more likely that they have trouble with the second genetic instruction. It's a very difficult instruction for all of us to satisfy, and one which people have a great deal of difficulty accepting. And that is, unlike my dog who had hardly any of this, people differ from other creatures, all other creatures I think, in that we have an instruction for power. That's the second arrow. We not only want to survive, genetic instruction, love and affection and belonging and caring and compassion, cooperating, very important human instruction. We also want power. And right now, in Ireland, more so than perhaps any other country in the world, today, yesterday, tomorrow, there's a tremendous feeling of power in this country. Barry McGuigan, what did he do? He knocked out somebody, or didn't knock him out, but he won a fight with someone, and all Ireland, not all Ireland, maybe not his mother certainly, but much of Ireland, at least the male part of Ireland, and to some extent the female too, feels more powerful because of what he'd done. And if Barry McGuigan had had his head knocked off in the first round, which certainly could have happened but didn't, all of Ireland would have chosen to depress. And there would have been massive depressing. Now there's massive joying. The whole country is in control to some extent because this need for power, we're somebody. People notice us. We're important. We have some say in the way things are run. This is a genetic instruction. It's built in. And it's among the most difficult instructions for children to satisfy. And the greatest cause, in my opinion, I'm writing a book about this now because it's control theories applied to schools, the greatest difficulty in our schools with children who do badly in school, and I can assure you that those children, the British, those young people, the British are all complaining about the so-called hooligans, uniformly they do badly in school. So where do they get power? Hooliganism is a way to get power. It's a way to say, I'm important, look at me, the TV cameras are on me. I'm not saying they went out to kill people and things like that, but they certainly engaged in behavior where it became possible. And so we see it in Lebanon where they're killing for power, and we see it all over, and certainly the Irish people. I read the history of Ireland before I came here. You're certainly not unaware of the need for power in terms of, as it applies to the Irish history and things like that. And we all human beings need it. Some of us are much more able to get it than others, but we all need it. And children who don't believe they have any power in school tend, in the United States, and I would imagine it's just about the same here, tend to give up and stop learning and try to get a sense of power through easier behaviors to gain power than through knowledge, which is a wonderful way to gain power. But it's hard work. It's harder. Knowledge is hard to get. You have to make an effort, and you can't get it quickly, and you have to be patient and see it accumulate slowly within you, and it takes a long time for you to be able to use your knowledge in the world in some way that's obvious to you that you've gained some power, especially for students who may not get the very top grades in the class and things like that. They find it easier to gain power through disruption and through all kinds of activities which they get involved in, which do give them a sense of power. Now you say, well, but they suffer so much pain. People are willing to pay the price. If you can find me a person who isn't willing to pay the price of pain to take control over his life or her life, then you'll show me a person that I've never yet seen. All of us are willing to pay the price of some sort of pain to satisfy our needs. It's ineffective. And our job as counselors is to help people not only to choose more effective ways, but also to look at our institutions and see, do our institutions, our schools per se, because that's what most of us are interested in, I'm certainly interested in, do our schools provide a place for a child to gain a sense I'm cared for? Do our schools provide a place for a child to say, I have some power in this school. I'm somebody here. Somebody listens to me. Doesn't mean that teachers and faculty have to lose power when children gain it. If the power they gain is through knowledge, then everybody gains it. And so perhaps we have to make knowledge more available through different ways and more understanding ways of teaching, which we might go into a little bit this afternoon. But the point is, that's a genetic need. It's not going to be turned off. And this is the need that drives us in the United States, a country which has gone mad with power at the present time, to even want to beat up on Nicaragua. We couldn't handle Vietnam, was too big an opponent. So, but Grenada went down pretty easy. And so now we may be able to handle Nicaragua. They have 3 million people and they have some cap pistols and things like that. Maybe if we throw 100 million troops in there, we can subdue them. But, and our president feels, every president in his second term gets a real urge to, came with Kennedy and Johnson went mad with it, and Carter restrained a little bit because he wasn't as power mad as some of the others. But Reagan was used to playing in cowboy movies, and he'd sure as hell like to get in there. And so it's unfortunate because the cowboy movie, the high noon, it's all part of this power which is pervasive in our lives. And this is what went wrong in that man's marriage. You see, he loved his wife and she probably loved him. But the power became so unequal. He wanted it all. And she couldn't live with him under those circumstances. Now, many women do. Most women don't abandon a powerful, domineering husband. They stick with him, but they do so at a price. And the price they pay in most cases, if it's not long-term depressing, it's diseases, most of which are in the rheumatoid arthritis capacity. You'll see a lot of rheumatoid people who are sticking out marriages where they have no power, and they can then, the physiologic wheel, the system breaks down. You have to fulfill your needs. And if you can't fulfill them, the system can't operate normally. So, again, she didn't want to get sick. She left. She probably would have gotten sick had she stayed. Now, if they can work things out so she would get her share of the power, that would be fine. And many women, because men usually want to grab the lion's share of the power, that's a cultural thing with men. It's certainly very evident in the Catholic Church, that's for sure. And the power, sometimes you're willing to settle for a reasonable amount, but not for nothing. You can't do that. And so these needs don't have to be 100% satisfied, but you have to do something to satisfy them. The next need there, well, let's talk to the bottom one, being free. We all want freedom. We all know what it is, and we all want it. Freedom to choose is the freedom we want. Freedom to direct our car in the direction that we want to drive it. And not freedom to run somebody else over in the process. Most of us understand that freedom has responsibility attached to it, that we can't be free to shout fire in a crowded theater and things like that, but still, the freedom, the responsible freedom, which is reality therapy defines responsibility as, which is to satisfy your needs and not deprive another person of a chance to satisfy their needs, or his or her needs. And that's important. Fun's a difficult one, yet it's an important one for this group, because I think fun is also a genetic instruction. I think little babies quickly learn to laugh and have fun and play little peekaboo games and everything like that. And why do we have a need for fun? Well, I happen to be personally an inveterate watcher of television. I'm one of the world's great TV watchers because I like TV. And I was very nervous when I got here to Ireland. I had first got a hotel room without a TV. I like to have it there even if I don't turn it on. And so one thing I watch TV for is I'll learn from it. There's a lot of work goes into making TV programs, and if you watch them, you can learn a lot with very little work. And so there's a lot of programs about animals on American TV, and I watch the turtle programs. I don't know if you know anything about turtles, but if you watch TV, you can learn a remarkable amount about turtles in a short period of time, because they've spent thousands of dollars to tell you about turtles. And when a little turtle, this is all about turtles in the Caribbean, big sea turtles, they come in, mama turtle digs a hole, lays the eggs, covers it up and leaves. That's the extent of her mothering. She'll never know those children anymore. Yet those little children do pretty well. The little turtle comes up out of the sand, looks around, heads for the water, swims away, little teeny thing just hatched out of an egg, and the man on the TV that narrates it says that turtle can take care of himself in the next 50, 60 years. It knows what to do. Lower animals are born with genetic instructions not only for what they want, which is survival, which is probably mostly what a turtle wants, but they also know how to do it. Now, as you go up the evolutionary scale and get to human beings, we're probably born about as helpless as any creature at birth. We know very powerfully from our genetic instructions what we want, but we have no idea whatsoever how to satisfy these instructions. The human being, like many creatures, but we more so than any others, we have to learn. Turtles don't have to learn. Therefore, if you want to make money, don't open a school for turtles. It won't work. You'll have a very difficult time teaching turtles much of anything. Turtles know all they want to know or have to know or need to know at birth. We know nothing, literally nothing. We can swallow. We probably even learn to cry, which we do very, very quickly as a way to express our fact that we're unhappy and dissatisfied. But the point is, if you look at the turtle thing very carefully, one thing will become apparent. If you want a fun pet, don't get a turtle. Turtles don't have any fun. I watched them for several hours on TV. I never saw one turtle turtling around or doing any of the things that we like to do. Horses horse around and dogs dog around and people around, but turtles don't turtle around. Now, why we seem to be, of all creatures, the most in search of fun, the most in search of enjoyment. And I think it's quite apparent. What's the biggest business in the world today by far? Dwarfs all other businesses, maybe 50-to-1 more money is spent in the world today. Of those people who have the money, and they're the ones that can spend it, it's spent on travel. Why do people travel? Why do I come to Ireland? Why do I want to talk to your group? Well, partly I wanted to share my ideas with you, but partly because it would be fun. I would enjoy it. I would learn something here. And maybe I could teach you something. It's fun to teach and it's fun to learn. I believe that fun is a genetic instruction built into all higher creatures because it's the way they learn. It's the reward for learning. And one thing that we'll see is that very frequently in our formal educational institutions, there is little thought given to having fun as we learn. And so children have to figure it out for themselves. There's no provision for it in the way things are taught or the curriculum, and this is unfortunate because it's a direct obstacle to learning. The normal way to learn is to enjoy yourself and have fun. I talked this over with my dog. It was a very intelligent creature. I talked a lot over with my dog. I said to her when she became an old hound, shortly before she died, I said to her, "You used to be so playful, and now you don't play at all. You just sit around." And she said, "I've become a philosopher." I said, "Baloney," I said. Anyway, the point is, she didn't play anymore. When I pressed her, she said, "Look," she said, because she knew all about control theory, she said, "I know all I want to know. I don't want to learn anymore. That's it." And you often meet human beings of exactly the same character as the dog. And if you meet a human being who knows it all, you'll meet a human being who isn't much fun to be with or be around. It's exactly the same thing. Fun is, you're involved with fun people, you're involved with people who are learning. Education can be very need-satisfying of the need for fun. Education also leads to power. It also leads to compassion and friendship. Many of the friends you make in school will be your friends for your whole life. And education also leads to freedom of choice. If you don't know what there is around you, there's no way to make a sensible choice. So education is perhaps the most need-satisfying of all activities. And yet, one of the major and immediate rewards of education, which is fun, is not recognized nearly enough by those of us who run the educational system. Therefore, when you're laughing, you're learning. And if you've ever taken a course in which there's been a lot of laughter, that course extraneous as it may be to your later life, you'll find the course sticks with you. You can't really, you've learned it, and it's hard to forget. If you've had a course which has been grim and with no laughter at all, after you take the final test, it's gone. It's like you never were there at all in many cases. And so the important thing to understand is that these are genetic instructions. They're how we're built. I believe this. I can't prove it, but I believe it. The only way you can prove or disprove what I say, and it's a simple and powerful way, is check it out in your own life. You're a control system just the same as I am. Look into yourself and see, aren't these needs operating within you? And check and see if you don't choose your behaviors as you live your life. And choose misery and pain when you lose control, and choose pleasure and joy as part of whatever behaviors that will come to you to gain control. And if you're out of control, check and see if sometimes taking some addicting substance, mostly alcohol, isn't some sort of a way to get you the feeling you're in control when of course really you're not. This is much more effective ways than that to gain control. So this is the beginnings of control theory. And reality therapy is a way to help people whom you counsel, who for all practical purposes their lives are not in effective control. Reality therapy is an approach which will, when you use it with them, help them to get their lives back into more effective control. We're always, in a sense, in control of our lives, but sometimes it's so terribly painful and effective that we should really think about moving toward more and better behaviors, about steering those front wheels of our car so the car moves in a better direction. And keep in mind, therefore, that while reality therapy, as a therapy, looks at the total behavior, we tend to focus on the two components over which we tend to have the most control. That is, what we do and what we think. It's very hard arbitrarily to just feel good. If when that man came to me, I had said to him, when he said, "Doctor, I'm depressed," I could have said, "Cheer up." I could have said that. We laugh because we realize that's such a stupid thing to say. He has no reason to cheer up. He's working hard. He's choosing to depress. He's not interested in some fool saying cheer up. But if he can move through writing a letter, thinking and doing something more effective, he will cheer up. He'll find this to be a more effective behavior than sitting home and moping. And so, keeping all of this in mind, we tend to have more control over the doing and thinking. But we have some direct control over the feeling too. If you have a child that's very sick in the hospital and the doctor says, "Look, when you visit the child, keep it light, keep it laughing, don't show how upset you are that the child is so sick," we can put on a brave and cheerful face even though we don't really think about it, because we'll say, even to pretend happiness now will be good for our child. And so we're capable of that too, but it's harder. It's harder to do for any long period of time. And so, and the physiology, whatever it may be, when you're in control, goes along with it. It's the two front wheels that we have most control over. So generally, as we counsel, we don't forget that these are total behaviors that our clients are choosing. We keep in mind what their genetic instructions are, because all of us are human beings and we all have the same instructions. And we tend to focus in reality therapy upon what we do and think and how we might choose a more effective way to deal with our lives at that time. Well, we'll get into this more this afternoon. It's been a long time now, but I wanted to finish this for you this morning and for the TV tape. I think we can break for lunch now, Arthur. Okay, thank you.
We look forward to 2 o'clock when we're back together again. And just to help you in your choice, if you're not used to the area here, there is a pub over the way, the Cat and Cage, which does lunches or sandwiches or that, or the Skyline Hotel down just this side as well. And also, if you haven't already noticed and you wish to follow up Dr. Glass work in more detail, the books are on sale outside, so take bags for £2 and the hardback for £5. The new book, Take Control of Your Life, which is very much on control theory, is just £5, so you won't get it at this rate anywhere else. So grab it. Thank you.
I think this space here is